So we continue with the all-star cast this morning. Harold, Howard.
So well known, nobody knows his name.
Howard Robinson is going to talk about polymorphism, natural science, mind and God.
Thank you very much, John. The organisers said I could start by making a slightly different kind of announcement, namely about Central European University, where I work. As you know, the Hungarian government passed a law specifically designed to make it impossible for us to operate. Namely, to say that all foreign universities had to have a campus in what was their originally registered country. Nearly all the universities in Budapest that are foreign are things like the University of such and such state in America having a campus in Budapest. So it's a small operation. And we exist only in Budapest, essentially. And so it was done just to catch us out, because we stand for, not for illiberal democracy, but for normal constitutional government, in so much as we get involved in politics at all. Well, an arrangement was made with the government negotiated with the state of New York, which is the relevant foreign state as far as this is concerned, because the American federal government doesn't enter into these things. And they seemed to reach an agreement that some teaching we were doing at Bard College in Upper New York, Leon Botstein, the head of Bard, is chairman of our board of trustees and a great friend of George Soros's. But the government has not confirmed that. But they have delayed the law making us illegal for another 12 months, so that nothing crucial happens before the election in April. We don't know what their intentions are. But one thing is very clear, that we'll be operating next year, normally, and that whatever happens, the university continues. We've been offered a rather luxurious site in Vienna, and George Soros has said he'll put up whatever money is needed in order to make sure we can continue. Now, that's important to this audience. There's a letter from our head of department, Hanok Ben-Yami, that I've added all our names to, that I hope people will pick up. If you've got any students who are thinking of coming to do a one-year MA with us or a PhD, they shouldn't worry. They'll get all the same grants. No PhD student pays anything, as far as tuition fees are all waived. And there's a decent living allowance. Maybe it's not so decent, but it's still pretty good. So keep on encouraging your students to come to us, both because it's an excellent department and because it's whatever number of figures you use in your part of the world to Viktor Orban and the government. So that's all I want to say. And please take a copy of Hanok's letter. There's only about a 12 there, a dozen there, if you might be able to influence anybody on this. Right, now down to the serious spiritual matters. I'm afraid I'm still a reader of papers rather than a shower of films, so to speak. If I go too fast, I'm too loud or too quiet, or too slow, or too boring, shout out. Why are some philosophers trying to revive a form of natural philosophy that was shown to be incompatible with natural science in the 17th century? These are just introductory remarks. I think there are broadly three reasons, two of which concern the natural world in general, and one is more specific. The general ones are, first, the need to find a rationale for taking a moderate position on the existence of composite objects. The mereological universalist says that every combination of objects constitutes a new object. The mereological nihilist says that there are no composite objects. Neither of these positions can make sense of our normal conceptual scheme, which gives an essential role to middle-sized composite objects, including living ones. The hylomorphist might be able to give a rationale in terms of form or structure for what is special about these objects. The second reason, I dare to suggest, without meaning it in a very hostile sense, there's something of a spirit of triumphalism among certain Catholic Thomists, a conviction that the scholastics were right after all, and that Cartesians and empiricists missed the point. In the background to both of these things is David Wiggins's work on identity and substance, which echoes the Aristotelian notion of substance, and the revival of the notion of real essence arising from the work of, for example, Putnam. That's not irrelevant either. But neither of these developments, David Wiggins or the Putnam stuff, made explicit use of the notion of hylomorphism. Those are the general reasons. The more specific reason is a belief that hylomorphism can resolve the mind-body problem. People got onto that one before they got onto the general scientific stuff. Whilst being neither dualist nor physicalist, although in some sense naturalist. I'm afraid I think all three of the reasons are mistaken. Although towards the end of this talk, I'll suggest a way that hylomorphism can play a role in a theistic interpretation of nature, but not within the broadly naturalistic Aristotelian framework in which it was employed by both Aristotle and Aquinas. Well, what's wrong with naturalistic hylomorphism? For its general deployment, I argue that although most, but not all modern hylomorphists assert that it is neutral about and compatible with closure under physics, perhaps the broad sort, I maintain that its significance depends essentially on a kind of downward causation which explicitly rules out such closure. In order to justify this claim, it's helpful or necessary to answer the question, are Aristotle's four causes, in inverted commas, causes? It's clear that aiteia is a more general term than cause, at least if cause is used to mean efficient cause. In Gregory Vlastos's words, quote, this is on the handout, I think, the handout mainly consists of quotations. Aristotle speaks of his four aiteiai as all the ways of stating to dia ati, the because. Aristotle's so-called four causes are his four becauses. That's in an essay actually on Plato, but he's attributing this to Aristotle. This was a general thing said when I was an undergraduate and graduate in the 60s and 70s. And the general idea is there's no competition between scientific causation and Aristotle's stuff because it's just different forms of explanation. And you can have all kinds of levels and difference of explanation, and it doesn't do any harm and have more than one, and they're not in competition. I think this is mistaken. The question that needs to be asked is whether Aristotle, or other hylomorphists, such as Aquinas, believed that one could, in principle, explain the distribution of matter and its motion by appeal to anything less than the four causes. The two rival hypotheses are, this is on the handout A, the mere distribution and motion of matter, or material objects, could in principle be explained solely from the efficient, perhaps plus the material, causes, but other vital forms of explanation, other kinds of why questions, need appeal to the formal and final causes. And B is all four causes need to be invoked to explain the distribution and motion of matter. None alone is sufficient. I think it's plain that traditional hylomorphists believe B. Aristotle talks about the role of the form in explaining natural change. That must mean the motion of bits of matter. It's because the cycle of water drawn from the earth and falling as rain has a mechanical explanation that no formal or final cause is needed to explain this, Aristotle says, even though it serves an essential purpose. It has a teleology. Growth and harvest wouldn't work without it. And it's because the spine could not be formed by the mechanical breaking of a single long bone in the uterus that form must be invoked to explain how they come to be vertebrae. Now, not everybody has been convinced by this interpretation, and it's difficult to sort it out conclusively because, on the one hand, anything like closure under physics or any other science that excludes mind depends on being able to assign these forces precise values, the reign of quantity. And this is not Aristotle's discourse. I'm not shouting, am I, too loud or anything like that? No, it's okay. On the other hand, Empedocles and the other materialists spoke in terms that implied physical closure. And Aristotle does talk of the material factor as operating of necessity and for the most part, which suggests something like a mechanical closedness with some probabilities thrown in. Nevertheless, there is much in physics too that seems to be inconsistent with closure under physics or any other self-sufficient material process. Aristotle seems clearly to assert that formal and final causes are causes of motion. And this is what you see on the handout. It's really the two sources that I'm interested in are 198a35 following and 200a 1 to 10. I think it's the second one is the clearer, 200a 1 to 10. So it's got S14 there. It's the second one on the handout. People usually investigate the causes of coming to be, and they see that what comes to be after what, and what first acted and was acted on, and go on seeking what comes next. But there are two sources of natural change, my italics, of which one is not natural, since it has no source of change in itself. Anything which changes something else without being changed is of this latter sort. For instance, that which is completely unchangeable and the first thing of all, presumably the prime mover, and a thing's form or what it is. For that is its end and what it is for. Since then nature is for something, this cause too should be known, and we should stay on account of what in every way. So that and the quotation before it are strongly defending the view, you can look at those later if you want, the view that formal causes and final causes actually have an essential role in the distribution of matter, where things are and how they are moving. And without that, you don't really have causes. One thing that's interesting, the very fact that artifacts are used to illustrate this, in the other quotation where he talks about the saw, the very fact that artifacts are used to illustrate the point about the formal and final causation shows how matter itself cannot explain how objects arrange themselves. Nobody thinks houses self-build. Nobody thinks saws self-manufacture. Something's got to come and do it to the matter. The matter has to be appropriate, but something has to be imposed from outside. Artifacts may not be natural objects, but Aristotle often uses them to illustrate points about the role of form and final cause in nature. Their relevance here can only be that form plays an essential role in making the matter do what it does. The properties of matter alone cannot determine this, any more than the parts of a house can arrange themselves. There's some more here that I've got on physics too and the way rain works, but I think I'll miss that out. I mentioned the rain case before. Aristotle makes it clear that the fact there's a mechanical explanation of how the water is sucked up and then comes down shows that you don't need a form to explain that, even though it obviously has great value and a purpose and serves a function. The matter does it on its own. Material and efficient causes may be overlapping there. So it seems that all the four becauses are needed at the fundamental level. And it is for this reason that it's not misleading to class them with causes in the modern scientific sense. They do not merely find a place in higher order explanations. It's not surprising that all four causes are needed. This is the science of quality, not quantity. And there is no precise quantitative value to any of the factors, leaving a natural space for a variety of considerations at the fundamental level. That Aristotelian science does not belong to what René Guénon, not somebody I'm a great fan of generally, called the reign of quantity, is part of its essential nature, and the attempt to impose it as a form of natural philosophy onto a science based on quantity is essentially tendentious, in my view. There's another point that illustrates the vast gap between modern science and the Aristotelian framework, and that concerns the identity of the parts of substances. Aristotle was not an atomist, at least in part because he did not believe that substances could be made of other substances. Hence, for Aristotle and Aquinas, matter is either mere stuffs, earth, fire, air, and water, or pure potentiality, prime matter. Most modern Aristotelians don't want to be committed to anti-atomism. They may not want to be committed to it positively either, but they don't think that's an issue that should be getting in their way. But they still want to affirm, some of them, parts of substances are not themselves substances. That's not Bill's line, but so it follows from this, I'll start in a minute, that if a water molecule, for example, becomes for a time part of a living body, it ceases to be a substantial individual entity itself, and therefore ceases to be the same thing, even if you can in some way tag and follow it. When matter was a piece of stuff and not an individual, this makes some sense. But it looks like arbitrary legislation when matter is made up of identifying individuals. What is achieved by such a maneuver? Among people who say this, I think most of the students I know of dual acclaimers at Fordham, for example, will strongly defend the line. I think Daniel, I've talked to defending a line, something like that. And I think William, is that right, when we discuss these things in Naples? So it's not, there's a strong tendency for certain hylomorphists in the Thomist tradition at least to want to say that parts of things are not individuals at all, even though you might be able to trace them through. And that seems to be, well, you can make that as a verbal legislation if you like. It's not clear to me what that would achieve. Okay, next section. That was the historical bit. Forget the history. Perhaps modern hylomorphists would agree with what I've said as a historical comment, but still insist that something very important can be saved from the tradition by understanding form as structure or organization. Daniel Dehaene quotes Etienne Gilson, a nice quotation from Gilson. It's on the handout. Scholasticism did not know how to draw from its principles the physics which could and should flow from them. So our first duty today is to be more faithful to the demands of realism than the Middle Ages were, and giving each order of reality its due. In each order, the reality of the form should be preserved, since without it one cannot account for structures, and it remains the principle of reality's intelligibility. Gilson implies here that modern scientific realism is rather easily reconciled with hylomorphism. Structure, uncontroversially, has an important explanatory force in some sense or other. And if form can be identified with structure, then it's reinstated. But it's no use if this is just a trivial verbal point. Just as Monsieur Jourdain in The Bourgeois Gentleman discovers that he's been speaking prose all his life, scientists who are interested in structures have been hylomorphists unawares. Of course, the issue is not this trivial. There is the claim, emphasized, for example, by Bill Jaworski, that structure is a fundamental category. The opposing claim is that structure is a matter of spatial relations, or perhaps spatio-temporal relations, combined with causal relations, where things are and how they influence each other in those relations. In response to this latter deflationary strategy, explaining structure in those terms, hylomorphists distinguish between static and dynamic structures. Bill did this yesterday, and others, implying that the latter, the dynamic structures, are what interests them. In a static structure like a crystal or a rock, the occupants in the nodes of the structure do not change. But in a dynamic structure, the same organization or pattern can have a succession of occupying parts. The paradigms of the latter are living organisms, though flames and fountains are also cited. Because the existence and identity of the structure is independent of its current parts, then it too is ontologically basic. Also seems to be the implication. The fact that flames and fountains are included should cause some suspicion. These things might be dubbed living, but not in a literal sense. They are surely mechanical processes, meaning by this that maintenance of the structure through change of parts comes wholly through the interaction between the things that come to be the parts. The structure does not have an independent influence. This could be compared with something else that constantly changes parts, namely a river. You cannot step into the same river twice if you individuate it by its parts, classically said. But what holds the river in its shape are the banks, which control the direction of the flow. It's not the internal dynamics of the water particles alone. This, it seems to me, is more like the role of form in Aristotle. It marshals the matter, given that the matter is of the appropriate kind. But in the flame and the fountain, the relevant particles marshal themselves. If the standard modern scientific theories are correct, the same applies to living organisms. Forget about minds for a minute. So the structure is a byproduct of the interaction of the parts in dynamic as well as in static structures. As such, structure cannot be deemed fundamental in a metaphysical sense. Now, I think this was part of Robert's objections to Bill yesterday, where Bill talks about as if he himself organizes and masters these bits and makes them in the position that they are. And your claim really was, and I was agreeing, you can't combine that with the thought that this is actually done by the interaction of the parts of their own will, and there's a difficulty there. Maybe there's mileage in the following, though I doubt it, and I'm not aware that anyone has suggested this. Structure could be fundamental and not unpacked in terms of spatial plus causal relations if two conditions were met. I'm not sure whether these conditions are on the handout. No, I don't think they are. They are, A, space itself is constructed relationally, and B, the relations in question count as count of structures. The relational view of space is one standard, though controversial, view. So the second one, B, the relations in question count as kind of structures, is the innovative part of the suggestion. One might try to argue for B on the grounds that, for Strawsonian reasons, the relations in question would have to be stable if a stable space was to be constructed out of them. And any such stable relations would count as structures. Then space is constructed from structure, and structure becomes basic. Even if this works so far, I think it would fall to the Oderberg objection to form a structure, namely that the structures in general are too prolific and too overlapping to do the job of individuating objects that form is meant to do. This criticism would apply also to Kit Fine's hylomorphism, which he admits allows or entails a massive overlapping of forms, if I remember rightly, in a way that deprives the notion of any Aristotelian sense. And if one concentrates on the very specific structures of the kind that hold together natural objects, they are not the sort of thing which space might be constructed from, but presuppose some more general set of spatial relations, I think. Right. Next section, challenging closure under physics. I've so far spoken as if modern hylomorphists regard their theory as compatible with the doctrine of closure. But it is not true of all of them. Some, for example, Lanao and Tay, if I've pronounced their names rightly, in William Simpson's volume, regard hylomorphism as essentially connected with the dappled view of nature as found in the philosophy of science of Nancy Cartwright and Jonathan Dupre. On this approach, a scientific theory applied to a sanitized laboratory clean context in which complicating factors have been removed. These factors may be dealt with, the complicating bits, by another theory in which some at least of the things handled in the first theory are not relevant. But, and this is the important point, there is no theory that unites all these perspectives. They are all, in a sense, context-specific. We are now in seriously deep water. Settling major controversies in the philosophy of science in medias res is not on, especially for someone, namely me, who is not a philosopher of science in the first place. But to plunge in, I've got two problems with this approach. First and generally, I don't see how, if all the theories apply to the one concrete reality, there could fail to be, in principle, a unified theory. For the reality itself cannot fail to be a unified whole. But maybe we never get to the level at which it could, in principle, be seen as unified. My skepticism about this last claim, that we couldn't ever get there, is pragmatic, but Cartwright and company regard their own theory as pragmatic in being close to the way science is actually done. My pragmatic worry is this. If the disunity were correct, I don't think that rockets would get to the moon and similar very exact operations. These things are not happening in a sanitized laboratory context, yet the theories give very precise, finely tuned results that work. The theories are therefore presumably not partial concerning the operation of the actual world. Cartwright's dappledness may apply to the so-called social sciences, which invariably fail in practice, but do not apply, as far as I can see, to decent natural sciences. More specific to the present context, it's unclear to me how exactly dappledness helps the hylomorphist. How exactly is form supposed to bring together these diverse theoretical fragments, and does it involve a genuine downward causation? I can see that it removes the obstacle of physical closure, but does that give a role to form? Perhaps there are people here who can help me with this. Or maybe John Dupre is of help. 2 quotations from Dupre on the handout. Cats and dogs, mountains and molehills, I want to argue, exist in just as metaphysically robust a sense as do electrons and quarks, assuming, of course, that the latter exist at all. What I want to deny, therefore, is that there is any interesting sense in which ontological priority must be accorded to the homogeneous stuff out of which bigger things are made. Another quote, "A central purpose of the ontological pluralism I've been defending is to imply that there are genuinely causal entities at many different levels of organization. And this is enough to show that causal completeness of one particular level is wholly incredible." The sentiment of these quotations is, in a sense, too moderate, in the sense that it does not give any priority to cats and dogs, or mountains and molehills, not themselves Aristotelian substances. They are just real like anything else. There is no suggestion that they hold the disparate ontologies of science together, giving the macro world a unifying role, and therefore a priority. If it could be established that macro objects had a given unity, and that science merely picked on different fragmentary ways of understanding them for given purposes, and this may be the point of the fashionable emphasis on science as the discovery of mechanisms, then something Aristotelian could be established. It would probably have to be the case that the priority of the macroscopic was not just from an anthropocentric perspective. I thought that various forms of instrumentalism might fit this better than the supposed realism of the Cartwright view. Van Fraassen could well take the given macroscopic world as basic and the rest as just instrumentally useful. And then perhaps you wouldn't have to have a unified science because all the different bits would serve a purpose relating to this. So Van Fraassen, as well as being a good, well, I think of that kind of stuff as idealism really, could also be like a hylomorphist as well, which makes it very attractive. The issue of another issue. The issue of downward causation is, of course, a central one. Downward causal explanation is no problem. The fact that the water is boiling, which is chemistry, causally, in a sense, explains why proton X, physics, has moved in a certain fashion. But this does not mean that the whole process requires downward causation to explain the distribution and motion of matter. This problem is not unnoticed. Daniel Dehaene, for example, tries to reconcile the new mechanist philosophy associated with Peter Machamer, somebody I only heard of the other week at a seminar in Budapest. I've never come across these things before, so I speak with absolutely no authority. Daniel wants to associate this with hylomorphism. The new mechanistic philosophy is closely related, I think, to Cartwright's approach, treating science as a piecemeal attempt to identify mechanisms that are responsible for whatever phenomena we want to explain. Cross-level explanations are common, but how to handle them is not uncontroversial. Now, 2 quotations here from Daniel. These points bring us to another apparent incompatibility between the new mechanist philosophy and hylomorphism. Most defenders of NMP adopt Craver and Bechel's rejection of top-down and bottom-up inter-level causation in favor of their distinction between intra-level causation and inter-level constitutive relations. In other words, there's not causation going that way, that goes that way, and those bits are made of these other things on the lower level, so to speak. However, many hylomorphists defend accounts of top-down or downward causation. Daniel Dehaan is not convinced that this is a serious problem. He goes on, "This conflict, I suggest, is less substantive and more terminological. The causal pluralism of hylomorphism opens it up to more forms of dependence than those captured by standard contemporary views on efficient causation. Classically, Aristotelians distinguish 4 kinds of dependence. So 4 distinct kinds of causes and explanations: material, formal, official, or agental, and final causes. The material stuff or components of some entity make a difference to what that entity is and can do. Material causes explain this kind of dependency. As we have seen, the organization of these material components also matters, makes a difference, and counts. Formal causes explain the dependency of a whole on the organization of its material components. Efficient causes explain the range of dependencies between events, properties, and substances that consist of moving, exerting forces, attracting, repelling, producing, generating, corrupting, transforming, and so on. Final causes do another job. I mean, you could read the rest of the quotation. You get the idea. Now, as we saw above when discussing Vlastos's comment on the 4 causes, everything depends on what one means by makes a difference and counts in expressions such as the organization of these material components also matters, makes a difference, and counts. Bill Jaworski, too, uses such expressions. But if the other forms of causal explanation do not make a difference to the distribution and motion of matter and material objects, then the difference between causation and constitution is not verbal and trivial, but an entirely real one. How are we doing? I've only gone about half an hour, really, haven't I? 35 minutes, is that right? Yeah. Hylomorphism and the philosophy of mind. How is hylomorphism supposed to help in closing the explanatory gap or answering the knowledge argument? In other words, answering the hard problem. Bill Jaworski claims that hylomorphism, not in his talk yesterday, but in his article in the Simpson volume, supports Gibson-Noe enactivism. I must confess that I can make no sense of that theory, not in Bill's form, but in the original Gibson-Noe forms, except as a form of behaviorism, unless in addition to the enactive component, it allows a phenomenal residue, which restores the problem. Maybe the behavioral element is criterial for the phenomenal, as certain Wittgensteinians and P.F. Strawson claimed. But I must admit, I can make no sense of these theories. If hylomorphists and handling the mind have to be thrown into the Wittgensteinian well, it should be made well known that that's the position that they're electing to enter. Daniel Dehaan deploys the new mechanistic theories, but like Bill, he seems to have nothing to say about consciousness or the hard problem. As with most new hylomorphists, the emphasis is on the capacities and powers, but this either neglects consciousness or assumes that a behavioral functional accounts of them are adequate. There's quite a long quotation here from Daniel. Hylomorphism's understanding of the induction or emergence of higher level properties is therefore radically different from the more well-known accounts of strong emergence. First, hylomorphism rejects standard accounts of strong emergence that maintained higher level emergent properties are products generated or caused by the organization of lower level properties. For hylomorphism, induced or emergent properties are not distinct from the organization of lower level organization. Perhaps I should have read parts, I'm not sure. Rather, the hylomorphic emergent properties are constituted from the organization of their components. Interesting, he's using constitution there. Second, it is the central form of a physical substance that grounds all of its conjugate properties, whether they be higher level psychosomatic powers or the lower level biochemical powers that are components within psychosomatic powers. Finally, hylomorphic emergence is not unique to psychological powers or phenomenal consciousness, but is ubiquitous to the entire biological world. Sorry, this is a very long quotation, I apologize. The hylomorphic account of hierarchies of organized levels that constitute an organism, where a higher level phenomenon is deduced or emerges from the organization of lower level components, is nearly identical to Craver's presentation of mechanistic emergence. When one says that the atoms compose molecules which are organized into cells, which are linked into networks from which mental properties spookily emerge, the first three steps are upward steps in a hierarchy of levels of mechanism. But the last, the spooky bit, is not. The ability of organization to elicit novel causal powers, that is, non-aggregative behaviors and properties, is unmysterious, both in scientific common sense and common sense proper. Appeal to strong or spooky emergence, on the other hand, justifiably arouses suspicion. Both NMP and hylomorphism reject standard accounts of emergence in favor of complementary, if not equivalent, alternative conceptions of organizational emergence. I think Daniel is really avoiding the problem that faced the philosophy of mind. Spooky emergence is entirely concerned with the emergence of consciousness, not about how atoms form molecules and the like. But no explicit mention of consciousness is made in the account he gives. And it's talked as if structure of its powers is enough to explain what mental life is without reducing it to something more or less functional. The hard issue of emergence is ignored by talking about how new properties arise in essentially non-controversial cases, atoms to molecules, etc. I could say something about Geoffrey Brouwer's trialism at this point, but I don't think I really have time. I can't get much out of it anyway. If anybody knows that work, I'd be happy to hear. Theism and hylomorphism. Artifacts have an ambiguous status under hylomorphism. On the one hand, they are amongst the best illustrations of Aristotle's notion of substance, yet they are not actual, or not actual paradigm, cases of it. They are good illustrations because they have a very clear teleology, unlike the natural objects, which are meant to be the paradigm cases. There is something specific that a knife or a clock is for, but though a dog might have purposes at given times, it doesn't have one overall telos, it seems. An oak tree, even less so. From a theistic perspective, however, it's more plausible to classify all things as divine artifacts, with a role in God's overall design. This helps with the Aristotelian notion of substance in the following way. We saw at the beginning that orthodox Aristotelians and Thomists do not want to allow that substances can be made of other substantial individuals. One way of not being a substantial individual is to be a stuff, like earth, fire, air, and water. Another way is to be an individual thing that is essentially parasitic on the thing of which is a part, like a hand or a foot. Atoms, which are, so to speak, indifferent to whether they are part of anything or what they are part of, do not fit either model. But there is, in fact, a middle position. A severed hand is not a hand, said Aristotle. A hand is a hand in virtue of its relation to its original body. But a brick taken from a building is still a brick. On the one hand, a brick is like an atom in that it can be moved from structure to structure, or just hang around in a pile, and is no less a brick, indeed the same brick. But bricks would not exist if there had been no buildings. They are created to serve that end. If the building bricks of the universe, its atoms, so to speak, had been created for the purpose of giving rise to more sophisticated entities like living things or us, then they would be less substantial than the objects they've been created to constitute. Houses are prize of bricks, so to speak, or walls. Another way of putting this is that one can reconcile closure under physics, for physical things, mind's another matter, with the irreducible teleology that defines Aristotle's hylomorphism, if one can impose the model of artifacts on nature. This does not restore hylomorphism as a form of natural philosophy, but as a specifically theistic metaphysic. And the key mark of form here is not downward causation, but teleology, or being made for a purpose. A feature which I think it is fair to say modern hylomorphists tend to ignore. I want to illustrate that. 10 minutes, okay. Yeah. The final cause is vital, for substances are generally defined by their ends or purposes. Modern understanding of substance, even from Aristotelians, generally want to play down or exclude teleological element. The association with teleology does not naturally recommend itself to the modern mind. David Wiggins, for example, my former tutor, says that it would have been possible and advantageous for Aristotle to distance his account of substance from his concern with final causes. The concern with teleology is presumably thought to be too closely connected with Aristotle's theology, or the idea that it is divine design or intelligence that gives objects their essential nature. But the rejection of function forces Wiggins into what is, from him, an unexpectedly reductive view of biology and life. See the next quote. Living things are, according to David Wiggins, so constituted that a delicate self-regulating balance of serially linked enzyme degradative and synthesizing chemical reactions enables them to renew themselves on the molecular level at the expense of their surroundings, such renewal taking place under a law-determined variety of conditions in a determinate pattern of growth and development towards and/or persistence in some particular form. In other words, biological life is entirely about maintaining existence by chemical interchange with the environment. It's not clear how behaviors other than immediate feeding and breathing fit into this model. The teleology of hunting for food or breeding doesn't seem to fit. Similarly, most modern discussion of form in Aristotle treat form as if it were more or less equivalent to structure. Matter that's being informed is a question of its being structured in a certain way. It is what one might call a matter of static, as opposed to end-directed, not as opposed to the fluid sense of structure earlier, but as opposed to end-directed organization. It emphasizes how objects hold together, not what their role or function is. This is presumably because, according to modern science, function is the byproduct of efficient causal processes, not a fundamental feature. Blind watchmakers and all that. Now, it seems to me that, insofar as the notion of structure captures an element in Aristotle's notion of substantial form, it's essentially connected to a belief in top-down causation and not just top-down explanation, which I've argued is inconsistent with modern scientific beliefs. But final causation is free of this constraint, provided that the mechanism is designed for a purpose by an intelligence. No one thinks that a clock lacks a telos, even though it is an entirely mechanical device, because the mechanism has been devised and constructed by an intelligence just for a certain purpose. I thought there was one thing else I wanted to say there. What was it? Yeah, I think David Wiggins thinks of himself as an Aristotelian, but it's much more in a Kant-Strawson tradition. It's about what's necessary for the kind of enduring existence that's going to give a shape and a permanence to the world as a whole. Aristotle's not interested in that question. And that's why one reason why he doesn't like the teleology. It's much more Strawson-Kant than it is Aristotle, despite everything else. Well, I want to end up by saying some things about transubstantiation, which is one of the reasons why all this stuff is interesting in my view. Edward Schillebeeckx and Karl Rahner proposed in the 50s and 60s the doctrine of transsignification. Schillebeeckx specifically emphasized that this meant a move away from stating the doctrine in terms of the category of substance, as it had traditionally been. Michael Dummett also took up this line of thought in his contribution to the Basil Mitchell Festschrift. I must admit, the only thing by Michael Dummett that I ever really got any illumination out of, not being a Frege fanatic myself, he took up this line of thought, but making certain vital reservations. The philosophical influence behind transsignification was Heidegger, as far as I can see, for whom, it seems, everything is what it is because of our attitude to it or use of it, which threatens the objectivity of the real presence. Dummett makes two modifications. First, change of significance is only true of certain kinds of things. Coins are coins, that is legal tender, only because of our attitude. But natural substances, Dummett says, are what they are irrespective of us. It's nonsense, in other words, to treat everything as if it were a human artifact, social or otherwise. There are only certain kinds of things that we are free to deem to be such and such. Other things just are them. Second, in the case of the Eucharist, it's not our say-so that we can deem the bread and wine to be the body and blood, but on God's. Human conventions exist whether or not God does, so to speak, but this deeming is correct only if there is a God and he has sanctioned this attitude. Dummett compares this to the adoption of a child. An adopted child is not a natural one, but if the adoption is effected by the appropriate authority, the adopted child has all the legal standing of a natural one. So on God's say-so, we can deem the bread and wine to be the body and blood. Nevertheless, Dummett, like Schillebeeckx, seems to shy away from the use of the category of substance. At least he thinks that the Thomist way of putting it leads to a degenerate concept of substance, rather like Lockean substratum, according to which it becomes detached from scrutable properties at all levels, not just from superficial ones. In fact, it's worse than Locke's substratum, because at the same time as being distinct from all its properties, it is nevertheless a substance of a definite kind, namely the body and blood of Jesus. As a criticism of St. Thomas, this seems to have force. The modernist Anglican Bishop of Birmingham in the 1920s, Bishop Barnes, said that we should see whether the bread and wine become body and blood by taking it down to the chemistry laboratory at Birmingham University. If one says, as one might well, that this entirely misunderstands the doctrine, Barnes could well reply that he doesn't understand the notion of substance if it's detached not just from the superficial sensible properties, but from the properties all the way down. And I think this is Dummett's worry too. But shying away from the category of substance is not meant with approval, being condemned in Mysterium Fidei, which is on the quote, which I won't read out. They won't have anything to do with transignification and transfinalization without the appeal to substance. In my opinion, Schillebeeckx's mistake comes not in making much of the idea of transignification or transfinalization, but in claiming that this is a departure from interpreting the real presence in terms of substance, and hence of ontology. As I've said, Dummett noticed that an important point here is whether the signification in question is signification for us, as the official criticism seems to suggest of the Heideggerian Schillebeeckx version, by its use of the term symbolism, in that quotation I haven't read out, or whether it is objective significance, which I take to be a matter of teleology, which is essentially independent of our interpretation or understanding, even if it exists in order that we might understand it. Which Schillebeeckx meant and whether he's clear on this, I haven't the knowledge to say, though the Heideggerian background suggests the worst. All that is important for my current purposes is to emphasize that I'm taking it in the objective teleological sense and thereby to tie it to the Aristotelian notion of substance. If this is what God uses it for, then that's what it is. If it's part of the incorporation into the body of Christ, then it's the body of Christ. So, conclusion. Hylomorphism as natural philosophy, no. Hylomorphism as a theological perspective, yes, if handled carefully. I would never have expected Bill to be asking the first question.
Thanks, Howard. I really enjoyed the talk. So, just a remark about closure principles.
Right.
And it's related to the way that you try to characterize form by appeal to your river analogy. So, imagine that somebody asked the question, a physicist asked a question about, or let's just start with an ordinary person. He says, I want to know why those fundamental physical particles, the ones that ostensibly compose you, are there, and why they behave as they do. And somebody says, well, they're there because Howard chose to stand there as opposed to somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And they're moving the ways that they are because Howard was gesticulating and speaking, and that's why they're there. I take it that the physicists at CERN wouldn't say, hell, we just spent several $billions trying to figure out why electrons do what they do, and it turns out that we didn't need all this equipment. It has to do with people. It has to do with guys like Howard choosing to do what they did. Clearly they're not going to say that. And the reason is that they're interested in causes of a different sort. So when they talk about why the electrons are doing what they're doing, the things that are going to answer that why question don't have to do with human agents. They're going to have to do with causes of a different sort at a different level of description, using different vocabulary. Studied, of course, by different means. And what that suggests is, if there's a sense that their explanations are inadequate, it's not because they're inadequate by likes of the methods that they're trying to employ to answer the questions that they're interested in answering. It's because in our day-to-day dealings, we're asking about different kinds of causes. So when we start asking about why you wanted to move this way or that way, then we realize that maybe the physics doesn't give us the story that we're interested in. But just because those kinds of causes aren't the ones that are studied by physicists doesn't mean that when the physicists do their work, they aren't always going to be able to find a cause of the sort that they're interested in. Which means that they could have closure within their own discourse because they're concerned with different kinds of phenomena, the kinds that constitute or that compose bigger systems like us. But once you talk about the bigger systems like us, now you're not talking about the raw materials, you're talking about those materials as they occur within a structured whole that engages in different kinds of behaviors. And I think that this is closely related to the idea that you suggested that structure could be understood as interactions among the parts. Now, if structure were just interactions among the bits of stuff, complex relations, then I can see why you would have the bootstrapping worry, the sort that Rob brought up. Because then it's like, well, my existence depends on the interactions, but of course those particular interactions depend on my existence, so you have this bootstrapping worry. The thing is, so that kind of misunderstands the notion of polymorphic structure at a basic level. So I think the way of getting at it intuitively, we can get it in a twofold way. One, using an example that Aristotle uses in Book 2 of the De Anima, and the other is using the work that Christopher was talking about in his talk yesterday. So in early on in Book 2 of De Anima, Aristotle has this example. He says, okay, beings like us are composed of earth and we're composed of fire. Earth has a natural tendency to go down. That's why our feet stay on the ground, because we're composed partly of earth. Fire has a natural tendency to go up. That's why we're able to grow. We don't just sort of collapse in a heap. But if left to their own devices, living things like us, which are composed of both earth and fire, would be torn apart. Mm-hmm. Something has to regulate and govern and proportion the operations of earth and fire when they compose us. Mm-hmm. That something is form. Likewise, in Christopher's example, you have these ways in which these biological processes are directed, as it were. Something proportions the way things operate. Left to their own devices, they might do this or that, but they don't, because they're not left to their own devices. In a living whole, there's something that regulates the way these things operate. That something is form. So form isn't just going to be something that has to do with the integration or the interactions among the parts. Form has to do with an entire entity and how these homeostatic processes get directed within it. So in that sense, it's going to deal with a different kind of cause from the kinds of causes that, say, the physics person is interested in.
Well, the physics person is also interested in how things interact given their spatio-temporal and causal relations to each other. And of course, in my view, that's what structure is. But your first point is bringing in philosophy of mind. Now, I think if there is an explanation in terms of basic physics of why I'm making, as it were, the noises I'm making now and how I'm moving my body, then psychological explanations are redundant. They become epiphenomenal. Well, you get to the same position as, say, Dennett's view on this, where it's just a way of, well, it's a way of interpreting or making sense of what something's doing, which is not having, sorry?
Only if you reject the hylomorphic view.
Well, no. Let's take something which nobody thinks is conscious. Let's take an oak tree. Now, it's certainly, the way an oak tree grows and how it develops is essentially dependent on how the bits are put together. Nobody is going to dispute that. Now, so the importance of structure, i.e. what the causal and spatio-temporal relations is of the bits, is not in dispute by anybody.
It's the question. You're using the term structure in a different sense. You're using it for those lower-level spatial relations and interactions, not in the sense of hylomorphic.
Well, one thing I did claim in talking about flames and fountains, the higher level sense, the dynamic sense of structure, where you get a succession of parts, as it were, entering into the same set of relations. If that's not being managed by an outside force, if it's only happening because of the interactions of the parts themselves, how they, as it were, manage their own relations, then I don't see that there is any difference, and I don't see that there is a hylomorphic job going on here.
That's also not the view, Howard. The view is that it's managed by a structured individual. So again, think about the examples that Christopher had, think about the example in Aristotle. It's not an outside force that regulates these materials, it's the organism itself. It's not outside.
Right.
It's never different.
The question is this: whether you can understand the way the organism regulates itself in terms of the causal dynamics of the bits and how they naturally influence each other and influence other things passing by that fall within their orbit.
The answer is no. Otherwise, it wouldn't need form. That's why that's central to the hylomorphic view. That's why the Dennett view doesn't work.
Well, in that case, you are moving, it seems to me, back to an Aristotelian conception of form, which is not the same as how things are put together. It's an extra force. And
it's not a force. It's a form. This is just
it's an extra influence.
This is a way that in which the causal monism of the post-Cartesian worldview gets smuggled in. The Aristotelian view says that there are more kinds of causes than forces. That's what the causal flow is. Okay,
if you mean by that in addition to the forces possessed by the particles that constitute it, in addition to those influencing the distribution of matter and their motion, there is something else influencing the distribution of matter and their motion than the way those things interact with each other, then you are an original Aristotelian. And that's not consistent, it seems to me, with a normal scientific view. And it's not just making these things different levels.
But why not? Why isn't that consistent with the modern scientific view? The physicist doesn't have to give up the work. The biologist can still do their work. I mean, Christopher's illustrating that.
Well, if you're right, then the pure physicist will not be able to explain, even in his own terms, why this matter is going through this motion and making these noises, because he's not talking about the forms in question, according to you, because that's not part of his subject. Yeah, so he won't know where the bits of matter are if they're playing an essential role in how the matter organizes and distributes itself. It can't both, but they're making an extra difference, and that they aren't, which is what it seems to me that you want to have it both ways and say.
No, I've explained why the physicist can't explain those kinds of things, but that doesn't mean that the physicist doesn't have something to explain. The physicist tries to isolate the raw materials independent of any way in which they're structured, but in our day-to-day dealings and psychological explanations, we're not concerned with them.
I think this could go on for quite a while.
Okay, good. Well, I actually wanted to ask two related questions that both have to do with the underlying quantum theory. So I think I disagree with both you and Bill, because I think both of you start with a picture of physics that's really a Newton
basically
Maxwell
Newtonian.
kind of picture.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think, in fact, quantum mechanics is in no danger of explaining why your body's moving around the way it is and so on. It just isn't even close to that because it has, I mean, this describes fluctuation of probabilities across this state space.
Right.
Particles don't have any definite position at all, not even close to a definite position. And in fact, particles don't persist through time, not at the fundamental level.
Right.
And so I think that's my first question. The arbitrariness of saying that the particle's not the same anymore once I've ingested it, that's everybody's problem. Nobody thinks that any kind of particle survives as an individual, identifiable individual over time in a quantum world. So that's the first question. The second one has to do with, again, why the adaptive world picture isn't actually very close to homomorphism if one takes into account the fact that the quantum level just isn't complete anymore. It isn't going to explain behavior at different levels. And if you take that picture, and I think that's the picture that Tay and Auer are absorbing, and that Cartwright also had, then you've got things at different compositional levels, right, with fundamental causal powers that are not reducible or explainable to what's going on at a smaller level, at a smaller scale. So how else to explain those powers except that there are forms that inform the matter that makes up those middle-sized objects?
I can't deny for a minute that, given my general ignorance of basic science, one automatically falls back into, as it were, thinking Newtonianly. Now, okay. On the Cartwright picture, I suppose there isn't any such thing as closure under physics. And the main brunt of my argument was that you can't have a closure and still have form doing a role. Now, if you want to say that the quantum world is, as it were, a bit like prime matter, in those, now the game's a different one. Now, I can't join in that game because I really don't know my quantum theory in so much as anybody does. That's to say, it's a kind of deus ex machina that sometimes people bring in to solve all kinds of problems. But if quantum theory ends up with, I mean, of course, you've got the problem of collapsing the wave packet in order to give you a definite thing. Now, if somebody could defend, as it were, a Copenhagen-y view, the people I know best, like Barry Lower and David Albert, don't want to do that, where without consciousness, none of these things could take a shape at all, or you'd have a kind of Everettian potentiality with only consciousness determining which one of them was the actual game in town, so to speak. I think one would have to start again of quite a lot of the thing. Now, whether that would make form, there's two uses of form going on here. One is kind of Aristotelianly taking the biological as the paradigm, and the other is the kind of thing which you get in Kit Fine and other people, almost any old structural thing of a dynamic kind counting as form. I don't see anything in what you're saying that's going to restore the priority of the biological necessarily, unless it's the priority of consciousness, which of course is not the same as the biological anyway. But it would be a way of saying that somehow or other you don't get determinacy until you've got a certain kind of something like organization at a bottom level. But I really, nothing I say on this is worth it.
Real quickly, because I think an Aristotelian shouldn't be committed to the view that only organisms are substances, right?
Right.
You're right, I think that it shouldn't slide into the Kit Fine view where there are substances all over the place that are overlapping with each other. But why not say that we look to the development of a robust science, so that there are substances perhaps at the level of thermodynamics as well as at the level of biology. And as long as we have a respect the kind of tiling principle that substances aren't parts of other substances, then wouldn't that be good enough?
Do you want to hold that principle?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Bill is quite happy to substances the other part of substances. You're not. All right.
In that respect.
Right.
And look, it doesn't seem to be surprising that the thermal that the things that would be thermal substances outside of a living organism are no longer substances once they're part of an organism, because they're playing quite a different role. They're being governed by the biological form in that case.
Yeah, the question what governing comes to would be, I mean, if you can still tag it and follow it through and still apply the original science to how it works when it's there, it seems to me to become rather a verbal thing to say that it's not going to count. But that's, yeah.
In the current literature, Which defenses of the teleological view do you think are most compelling to secular philosophers?
Which defences of the...
Of the teleological view, like whose work or which text?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at in the question in the following sense. If you think that there's reason to believe that the world was made for certain purposes and according to a certain plan, analogously to the way that a clock is made by a maker for that purpose, then the teleology is in it. Now, of course, you've then got all kinds of arguments from Hume and all the rest of him. You look at the universe and you think, what on earth is this for? And it wasn't made very well and all that. So you've got a whole business from the argument from design. But it would involve, what I was saying would commit one to not necessarily using the argument from design. If you start off with the theism, then you can use the design model to explain why the bits are there making the things they do. And you can give priority to the things that God wanted it to turn out that to primarily be. Us, for example. So that's all I'm saying. Does that answer your question, or were you getting at something else?
You said that almost all modern people with homomorphism want to deny that
I see.
there is any teleology and instead destruction.
Right.
So I was just wondering, what is the strongest effort on the other side so far?
I see. Well, if you're not including conscious minds and intelligence, I don't see any reason for including within a naturalistic account of the rest of the show anything teleological. Just as you don't have to have teleology to explain how a clock works, you only have to have teleology to explain why anybody made a clock in the first place. So I don't think, I'm not a scientist, but I don't think that by looking, now of course in biology you can't do without function, at least I would have thought so, but other people don't want to say that. Certainly, clearly, David Wiggins is trying to get away from any functional explanation in his rather bizarrely reductive account of what biology is about. But the how things work on this picture is never going to be a teleological one. The why they arose is not going to be teleological if you're going to buy a Darwinian account of how the physical world works itself out. And so it would have to be entirely on the theological level, why God set up a system that worked this way in the first place. Fine-tuning and all that, probably, that you got any of that in, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Howard. Partly what I want to do is to understand better the view. Let me start with the worry. So the type of allomorphism you think might be helpful for theological purposes seems to me to have lost one of its defining features of allomorphism and not even being allomorphous anymore. So if I understand you correctly, you're thinking that in the case of in the body of Christ, whatever has become part of it has taken on a different telos, and that's why it's not anymore what it was before being there.
Yeah.
And that's a useful way of putting to use Aristotelian notions of teleology to get an account of Christological issues. But it seems to me that there is nothing there about unity of substance, which is, I think, crucial to allomorphism. So you could do everything you want to do with subjugating the goal for which the purpose of something to the purpose of something else of which it is a part, without importing any aspect of allomorphism as we understand it in the traditional way. So I think this connects with earlier things you said in the paper, where I understood you thinking that the hand as part of as severed from the human being is not a hand anymore, but the bricks taken out of a house is a brick. Mm-hmm. And I'm, with those who think that for Aristotle, artifacts are substances, and so they don't have parts that are substances themselves, otherwise the unity of the substance would be threatened. So I think that the brick as part of the house is not the same type of thing as the brick outside the house. I think we had this discussion before, and you mentioned it here. Your argument is that, well, you can track the brick from being, you know, in a heap and then being part of the house. You can just track that thing and its movements. But I don't deny that. I mean, I'm not a part nihilist. So I think, yes, that brick, there is physical continuity between the brick as outside the house and the brick as part of the house. And you can even identify that brick as a brick in the house. But what has happened when the brick has entered the constitution of the house is that it's formal. Its form, its individuation has changed. The principle of individuation of the brick is now dependent on the principle of individuation of the substance, which is a constituent, namely the house. And so it's not brick anymore in that sense. It's just a functional part of the substance of which it is a constituent.
Right. I mean, I said something that is not necessarily a million miles from that, namely that it's as if there could be degrees of substantiality there. It's subordinate to the things that it's for, even though it's treatable as an individual. And it's certainly, if you take it out of the house again and then do something else with it, it is the same one in some perfectly respectable sense, and in that sense it is an individual. But as far as unity goes, one of the things which almost nobody really tries to get to grips with, it seems to me, in the Aristotelian tradition, is the unity of essence. Aristotle, I mean, the modern use of essence is very close to definition. So you would define things in terms of characteristics, F, G, and H, and that's what makes something a Q, and you do it just by the properties. The unity just consists in, as it were, the conceptual unity. Now, Aristotle struggled to find a way in which the unity was not, as it were, a conventional arrangement of properties. And you get the idea of the highest differential, which somehow sums the rest up, so you've only got one property doing all the work, so it's really unified. None of that works, as far as I can see. Now, where does that leave the notion of the unity of a substance, if it's defined by its essence, which is done that way? I wouldn't like to say. I think what you can get out of Plotinus, and I tried to say some of this in part 3 of the book I published last year, is that, as it were, the mirror of which is the human self, is the only true unity, and somehow that's projected onto other things by our understanding of them. None of them have it in their own right, at least to the same degree. Now, that's a very different kind of approach from the naturalistic approach of Aristotle, but Aristotle never explained, or rather, never managed to make good, it seems to me, his understanding of this kind of unity.
Yes, thank you. And I have sympathies for this issue. I mean, I think yes, but let's not talk about it now. I just want to say, so I think what I feel would be helpful to us as listeners of your talk or readers of your book is to hear a bit more about what happens when something takes on a different final cause than the one it had before being part of a certain composite. Because at least those who think that the parts get re-identified in the substance by taking on a different identification principle, give a story about what happens. You know, the identity of that brick changes when it becomes a constituent of the house. But when you're saying, well, something that enters into the constitution of something else takes on a different final form, what account do you give of that? What happens?
Well,
is that like, you know, what happens to the initial final cause, and what's the relation between the initial final cause and the added one?
What I said about transubstantiation comes originally from a talk I gave to a set of German Catholic philosophers in Mainz, where I was arguing that Berkeleyan idealism was not inconsistent with Orthodox Christianity. Now, if you think that the external world, as much as it exists, is actually a nomological structure in the mind of Nous or whatever, the Logos, and if you think that what the things are depends on what that nomology is aiming at, what it's all for and what it's doing with it, then that's what changes. And that's the only out there substantiality that there is beyond the phenomenal world anyway on this picture, and that's what changes. So that's not Aristotle.
So is that the initial final cause, the final cause that something has initially is
Yes. Yeah, I mean, what ordinary bread and wine are for is no longer what these things are for. And that's part of the divine understanding of it.
But the thing remains the same type of thing, even if it takes on a different final course from the one that you mentioned.
Well, it depends what you mean by keeping the same accidents. You see, I think where Bishop Barnes had a point, the Thomist reading of it looks as if what survives are the superficials. And therefore Barnes' challenge was, go and look at the accidents right the way down, and if they're remaining the same, what is it you're saying has changed? And that's what worried Dummett. Are you saying it's got a different substratum? Well, of course, that it doesn't even make sense, because a substratum has no character whatsoever and isn't the same as a substance in the kind of stuff thing. Though it could be if you think of the substratum as being, as it were, the divine will or the divine intention, what God is doing with it. That could vary, and that's, if you think of that as the kind of substratum, so to speak, the nature of the divine will as operating in that thing has been transformed by its own intention, then that's what you get. But this is not orthodox Aristotle, and Aristotle never managed to make sense of what he wanted to say in these things, I don't think, anyway. So that's me, not him.
Thanks very much. I'm also interested in something similar.
Right.
I enjoyed the discussion of the real presence. So just to check I understand you first, is the idea that if we're going to be theists, then we get to say that everything or every substance counts as a divine artifact, and therefore we sort of get the talent for free, as it were, because it's what God's doing with the stuff that gives us their substantial, character. And then using that, we can say, well, people like Dummett and others in that sort of vein should have gone further. They needn't have been worried, because the signification stuff is signification also for God. So it's something to do with what God's using stuff for. So in a rich ontological sense, there's a real change either in the substance or of the substance, because God's using this stuff differently.
Right.
Is that the picture?
I think so. Sounds fairly connected with what
Good,
I'm saying.
good. That's how I was kind of putting it together. Then, as you might imagine, there's now a question. The worry is, well, that might be a coherent metaphysics of what's going on, and this might connect up with your views on the idealism stuff, which you just talked about. But that seems to leave us in a difficult epistemological position, right? So suppose there's a tree, and the tree originally God is using to, house a bird or two or something, and then later on God chooses to use it to provide shade to weary travellers.
Right, it's not a different object.
It's a different substance.
Well, right.
And
Yeah.
the extent to which it isn't is going to be the extent to which the Eucharist is not different to what it was before. And it seems to me that the pressure from the Mysterium Fidei and others, and the want for this to be a really different substance, is going to pull you in one direction, but then wanting to not have sort of undetectable changes in substances all over the place when God starts to use stuff differently is going to want to pull you in the opposite.
Okay, the two different things that were happening to the tree that you talked about, shading somebody and having a bird in it, obviously are not getting down to whatever the bottom use God has for oak trees is, which is going to be more, as it were, species specific. Now, if you want to say what is the purpose, why did God make oak trees, not to mention malaria, flies and all the rest of it, I'm no better on that than anybody else. But it won't be to do with what the thing happens to be, how happening to it at a given time, the shade and the bird. So that it would have to be something more fundamental, more species related than that. And it may be that the degree to which things are substances on this view is going to vary in all kinds of ways. As many philosophers have said about various doctrines of substance, including Plotinus, I think. So this is not Aristotle. Now, your accusation wasn't that it wasn't Aristotle, but that it was getting me in trouble as well, and I'm not I don't know that I'm sure about that. But
presumably, setting aside the tree example, presumably there's still a worry that God's use of things will change, and change in exactly the same way as you are warranting in the Eucharist case counts as a change of substance.
He must have had, as it were, a particular telos in mind in creating the various things that he did. And those don't, under the order of nature, change. And that's why the Eucharistic case is a different one. It is not a change according to the order of nature. Something like that. Those may be just words.
Going back to the earlier question you were talking about, and the point about sort of just legislating that the particles that become a part of the substance
Right.
change into the substance. And I was thinking that all these different theories have different theoretical commitments that entail things that look, when you look just at the conclusions, they look like they're just legislating arbitrarily.
Right.
So that's not going to be something unique to the hylomorphous. But one point is to distinguish, you might say that hylomorphous have different views about how the form of the structure transforms all the parts that are a part of a substance. And that Bill's view is one that allows for the parts to transform, the structure to transform the parts without making it be the case that the parts can't be substances. So his view doesn't rule out that the parts could be substances.
Right, Bill's view
whereas
does not, yeah, no.
more Aristotelian view would be one that it does rule that out. So the transformation has to be more radical and has to make the parts have the same identity, or have the identity of what the parts are to be a part of the substance given by the structure. But neither of these views require what you seem to suggest, is that they can't have, when they take on a part, the part can't have any continuity or similarity from when it's in the wild and when it becomes a part of the structure. And so you seem to be indicating that, tracking the way in which an oxygen particle might be taken up into a living being, and that the fact that you can track that is indicative of why there's a deep problem here, and that we're just legislating that it's either is the same substance or is not as the same substance. But any view outside of hylomorphism is even going to have to deal with this issue, and the point isn't that there has to be complete continuity, or there can't be any continuity of the properties when it is out in the wild from when it becomes part of the substance. So neither the really radical transformative view of hylomorphism, nor the more minimal view that Bill has, neither of them require that there can't be any continuity of the properties from when a thing is a substance in its own right out in the wild, and then when it becomes part of the substance.
Right. Continuity of properties is okay. Earth, air and water, water remains damp, wet all the way through. I did try and make something of the fact that I think it's not accidental that Aristotle is not an atomist, and that his matters are all either stuff or prime matter, where individuality doesn't come into it. Now, so I do think whenever you begin to be somewhat atomistic, I mean, even if quantum theory is not atomistic, molecules are, in the context of this debate, relative atoms. So I do think it's the hylomorphist who has this problem, in so much as, or the Aristotelian has it, in so much as his denial that there's anything identifiable as a totity, or whatever it is, as an individual below the whole organism sense, is an important part of the theory. Now, if you think that's not an important part of the theory, then that's when I think you begin to get into this sort of legislative, we don't call it the same business, even when you can follow it. I would have thought, you see, on the Aristotle picture, or in the earth, fire, air and water picture, you couldn't even follow which was the same cubic centimetre of water once it got mixed up with other things. There wouldn't be a sameness there for it as an individual. Not that I'm not aware that this is discussed in any great length, but there are no units.
What you can track is the quantity of matter, not to drop, for example, in a bucket of water, but the quantity of matter.
Yeah, the quantity, you can say how much there is.
So, that's in support of Daniel's point. I mean, you don't, it's a fish, your view is compatible with the possibility of tracking just the quantity of matter, and that's all you want. Even a stalwart hylomorphist like myself is happy with.
Because it's not claiming that what's observable.
Yeah.
The substance isn't per se like the observable. I mean, part of the way we understand what the substance is through the observable properties. That's the whole story. That's part of it. But you're asking that the substance and the substantial changes be completely transparent and observable in the way that we track them. And if there's a substantial change, then you shouldn't be able to track it. There should be something entirely new. But that's not a claim that either the radical traditional Aristotelian transformativist view or Bill's more minimal transformativist view is committed to.
No,
So you're demanding them something that their theory isn't actually committed to providing account for.
No.
The substantial change is not something that's going to be observable in the way in which you could still track the same. There could be a continuity of the matter that you want to track.
certainly there's got to be that which underlies the change, and therefore is there before and thereafter, and you can say what that is in some sense or other, and that will be attached to certain properties, but I don't see that it's attached to, and it may even to quantities, but not to individuals, I don't think. I don't know that this is discussed in any great detail in Aristotle, but it's, if you think that he gives more than one reason for not being an atomist, but if you think this is one of them, and if you think it's important to his notion of substances, they're not made of other substances, then I think there are problems. But maybe he's just wrong on that, and you can go back on it. Yep.
Great. So we started a bit late, so one last quick question.
What are the capsules in the list?
I'll try. I was wondering whether the disagreement between Howard and Bill could be couched in scientific terms. So if scientism says that science will one day explain everything, and when it does, any other type of explanation will be redundant, Howard, do you accept that claim and yet reject scientism?
Right.
So you think that scientism is right to say that if science one day explains everything, then any other explanation will be redundant, but you don't believe the antecedent is true. And Bill, are you saying that that claim is not true, because one day science might explain everything, but that won't make every other explanation redundant?
No, I think we both deny the antecedent.
You both deny that science will explain everything.
You think science might explain what motions I'm going through, but it's not what we're interested in, that kind of explanation.
I think there's more that's going on than just the motions.
Right, well, it depends what the goings on. Okay. I do argue in part two of From Knowledge Argument to Mental Substance that if the bottom level is closed, in some sense or other, the rest... I'm only following David Armstrong in this. Armstrong says the only real universals are those in the bottom sciences, and the rest are just predicates. And I think that's right. And
But that's highly inimical to the holomorphic world.
absolutely, it's inimical. And what Armstrong doesn't notice, and that I argue, that this presupposes dualism, because the thing that has the perspective on the world to make these different predicates, can't itself be predicate created. And that's what's wrong with Dennett and all those things. So that's the argument of part two of my book. Now, the alternative that Bill holds, and I think somebody like Barry Lower holds, who would believe in perhaps a stronger version of closure, is that things can be not fundamental but still perfectly real. Whereas my view is that if it's not fundamental, it's only real in the sense that a table is bits organized table-wise. We have a perspective on things, given what we like, and that we don't see the bottom level. It's not like we know there's a crowd is not real in the sense that we know there's no more to a crowd than the people because we can see the bits, or a swarm. We don't see the bits of the atoms in the chair. If we did, we'd say, okay, we've got this predicate chair, or indeed the predicate oak tree, but it's just a way of talking about the way these things are put together. Because of our size, as it were, we don't see the bits. So we're working from where we are. So it's not just conceptual, it's a perspectual, it's a perceptual perspective we have. But nevertheless, if the thing, only the simples are real, that's why I'm a simple, in more sense than one, no doubt. Yeah, so that is my picture. That is my picture, and it's not Aristotle.
Both physicalists and substance dualists will endorse the same view of the natural world, the one that Howard just articulated. But that's the view of the natural world that the holomorphist rejects, because the holomorphist says it's not just the little bits of stuff that are really real. When you get those things, you have structured wholes, those are equally real because structure is a basic ingredient of the universe, in addition to those little bits of things that the physicalists and the substance dualists say are the only really existing things. There's also a form of structure that makes other things just as real. And that's what we do.
Okay, I might push you on that.
Great, thanks. So I think that's time to finish up, and Chris will be back at 4:30.
Thank you.